Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Indian knowledge systems offer unique perspectives that make this knowledge system Bharatiya and hold immense value in addressing contemporary and emerging challenges. Let's know all about the sources of this Indian knowledge system and much more from Professor Ganti Murthy.
Namaste again. In our previous episode, we had talked about what is IKS, what makes this knowledge system uniquely Bharatiya or Indian, and we had talked about how the Jivana Darshana, the Jnana and the Vijnana inform the Bharatiya Drishti, Bharatiya Jnana Parampara, and the Laukika Prayojana of all of these knowledge systems that are existing in our Bharat since time immemorial, and which are relevant today and will remain relevant even in the future when we confront some of the unforeseen challenges that the world has not faced in the past. And now, what the biggest things, in fact, if you look at the Indian subcontinent, the Bharatvarsha, we have been a tremendous producer of various sources of knowledge. And when we talk about all the sources of knowledge, then it has been passed on to us through manuscripts, it has been passed on to us through oral traditions, dadi or nani ke nuske, small home remedies. It has been passed through us to us through the way that we celebrate our festivals, the way that we make our garments, the way that we basically preserve our food, the way that we eat different types of food at different times of the year and celebrate our festivals. So many things that all aspects of life are basically imbibed in this knowledge system. So, and then we have been subjected to many bouts of imperialism, colonization, and things like that. And they have damaged some of these traditions, definitely. And due to neglect, due to our own neglect, and due to other economic pressures, due to the survival necessities, some of these traditions have been dormant, or some of them have been lost also. Therefore, when we look at things today, we have so many sources of knowledge. It becomes very important for us to understand how do we look into any sources of IKS knowledge. How should we look at it? What kind of knowledge is there? And we will talk a little bit about the sources of IKS knowledge today. So if you look at the classification framework for the IKS, so you can think about it in broadly two ways: the literary, that means the textual traditions, and the non-literary traditions. In fact, by far, the non-literary tradition is by far the largest. And these are all the oral traditions that are there in many, many languages. In fact, all of the IKS occurs in all languages of Bharat. The biggest thing, if you think about it, are in the regional languages, Sanatana Dharma and Dharmic traditions. There are, of course, the core of Indian knowledge system talks about the 14 Vidyasthanas or Chaturdasha Vidyasthanas. Sometimes they will also call it as Ashtadasha Vidyasthanas. And various works of many religious leaders, philosophers, all of that form the core of the Jivana Darshana. And then comes the Jnana part of things, and then the Vijnana part of things, basic and applied sciences, engineering, technology, architecture, Vastu Shastra, alchemy, Rasayana Shastra, aesthetics, basically Natya Shastra, Kavyas, Kavya Shastra, arts, health, Ayurveda, wellness, yoga, psychology, public administration, Chanakya's Arthashastra, the code of living, Dharma Shastras, all of these, and along with that, not just in the Vedic philosophy, Sanatana Dharma, but also in the Buddha, Jaina, Sikh, all of those philosophies, we have a lot of texts that have been written. So this, if you look at classification framework, this is one classification framework that you can adopt. There are other ways to look at things, but this is just one way of looking at things. And if you look at the entire sources of literature, again, here I'm talking about primarily the textual traditions. Because oral traditions, there are so many that you don't even have a way to classify them. They're just available in everywhere. For example, just to give you some examples, there are oral traditions where we talk about as basically as different proverbs. For example, we can say in many languages we have things about when the rainfall comes, they will have some kind of a thing, and they will say, Telugu for example, we'll say ulli chese melu talli kuda cheyadu. That means the benefit of a onion, the garlic, is something that even mother will not look at you that after you that well, like a garlic. So ulli chese melu talli kuda cheyadu. But that's essentially talking about the medicinal value of garlic. And there are similar things in all languages across the country. And there are dance forms from Arunachal Pradesh where they will teach the entire process of farming millets, from the plowing of the land to harvesting of the grain and bringing them and storing them, through a dance form. There are many art forms where they actually teach you various things. In fact, there is a puppetry dance in Bengal where they tell you the entire story of fishes, but they're not really telling you a story of fishes through that dance and the puppetry. In the puppetry form, they are telling you how to live and the societal relationships. There are so many ways the non-textual traditions are basically carriers of the Indian knowledge system. But then, looking at the textual traditions primarily, there are primary sources. That means the texts written on palm leaf manuscripts, paper manuscripts, and birch leaf manuscripts, stone inscriptions, copper plates, all of those things are primary sources. And then there are translated primary sources which have been translated. For example, if I want to look at Chanakya's Arthashastra, so there is a palm leaf manuscript, maybe in a library, that again, in like Mysore Oriental Research Institute, there is a manuscript there on Chanakya's Arthashastra, and written in Devanagari, in Grantha Lipi. And that could be something translated into English. We have a lot of translations of Chanakya's Arthashastra in English. That is a translated primary text. Then we have secondary sources which are based on the primary sources and translated primary sources. Let's say there is a commentary on Arthashastra, that is a secondary source. And these are the types of sources. And you also can look at types of resources, whether it is a manuscript, it is a book, it is a research paper, it is a monograph, and things like that. And they can occur in many locations in various forms. For example, it can be a book, it can be a manuscript, it can be a film, it can be a digitized version of a text. Either it is a searchable text or a digitized text. These are all the kind of things that are available. And then, even when you look at a text, there are various categories of texts. For example, there is a sutra text, which is like a small aphoristic treatise. So it will have it's a very small work that, it will be very condensed, densely in knowledge, and something that will not be for a common person. It will only be written for the expert of that domain. And then there are bhashyas, which are for the students of that particular thing, which is a commentary on the sutra. And then there are these vartikas, which are essentially like revisions and rejoinders to the commentaries and the sutra text. There are karikas, which are essentially versified technical treatises for making some calculations and things like that. Vyakhya is like a gloss. If I give you some example today in today's framework, if you think about the laws of thermodynamics or the Newton's laws of motion, they essentially will be simple statements or a few equations, Navier-Stokes equations from fluid mechanics. They are simple equations, but they are essentially in the sutra form. The equations that we talk about, Maxwell's electromagnetic that equation, field equations, or Schrodinger's wave equation, or Navier-Stokes equation, they are all essentially sutras, because they are telling you profound amount of knowledge through very short, concise, basically formulation. Now the bhashyas will be commentaries on it. So today we have a lot of textbooks that will explain in a, let's say you have basically Schrodinger's wave equation, then it will talk about, there could be a textbook on physics that talks about all of these equations, why, how it was derived, all of those things in great detail. So a student of physics can go to that textbook and learn about the Schrodinger's wave equation. But then once he or she has learnt it, she will not need this entire textbook. Just looking at the Schrodinger wave equation, they will be able to tell you. So that is a sutra. So it is only after you approach the bhashya that you go to the sutra. And then there are these revisions. So you have first edition, second edition. Sometimes there will be some opposing theory that will come, and all of those books will be written. Those are all Vartikas, the second edition, rejoinders, all those things. Sometimes we are also familiar with something like, say, completely dedicated for the numerical solutions, example problems and numerical solutions. Especially if you are preparing for competitive exams, we have these guidebooks kind of a thing, which will give you 10 different ways to solve the same problem in all variations of the problem, how to solve it and things like that. They are just numerical calculations. They will not explain to you, for example, all the theoretical details like a Bhashya will do. They will not even have the sutra kind of thing. They will just be how to apply this kind of a knowledge. And the Vyakhya is a glossary of terms. These are a kind of texts that we used to have. And this is the classification that is there in the traditional knowledge systems, in the Indian knowledge systems. Therefore, if you want to, for example, the reason why this is important is, if I am going to look into a sutra text and ask for proof there, you will not find it. If I'm going to look into a Karika text, which is essentially about solving numericals, and then ask for proofs, you will not find it. You want to understand the proof, the reasoning, the rigor, and how did they arrive at that particular sutra, or how will they calculate in a Karika text. You'll have to go to a Bhashya or a Vartika to understand the things. Therefore, it is very, very important that we understand the category of text so that the purpose of the text is very clear for us. So, the 14 Vidyasthanas I was earlier referring to are the 4 Vedas, of course, the Rik, Yajur, Sama Vedas and Atharvana Vedas, and the 6 Vedangas, Shiksha, Vyakarana, Nirukta, Chandas, Shastra, basically Jyotisha and Kalpa, and Ashtadasha Puranas, 18 Puranas, Itihasas, Ramayana and Mahabharata. Again, these are all the Itihasas are not history texts. They are a very Bharatiya perspective of looking at the Itihasa, the history. And 6 darshanas, which we have Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Yoga, Sankhya, Purva Mimamsa and Uttara Mimamsa, or Vedanta. And we have various, these are the 14 Vidyasthanas. So 4 Vedas, 6 Vedangas, Puranas, Itihasa and 6 darshanas. So Itihasas, both Ramayana and Mahabharata, are considered as to one part. Puranas are considered one unit. Therefore, in the count, you will have 14 Vidyasthanas. And in addition to that, we have various Samhitas like Shushruta Samhita, Charaka Samhita, Ashtanga Hridaya. These are all called Brihatrayee in Ayurveda, big ones. The Patanjali Yoga Sutras, we have Mahabhashyas, we have Arthashastra, Viduruniti, Bhartrihari Shataka. When we talk about different laws and things like that, how do we conduct politics, all of these things. Then when we talk about mathematics and astronomy, we have Baudhane Shulva Sutras, Aryabhatiya, Bijaganita, Leelavati. Then we talk about astronomical texts, Surya Siddhanta, Grahalagava, Siddhanta Darpana, so many things. So these are the kind of primary sources that are there in IKS literature. I am just giving you a glimpse, not even a drop, from this ocean of Indian knowledge systems, primary literature. And you know, when the Nalanda was burnt, it burned for 6 months. So that was the amount of books and manuscripts that we had even at that time. And so it's a very vast this thing. So Aryabhatiya, for example, if you have a translated source, so for example, Aryabhatiya, which was written in Sanskritam in about 1500 years ago, there are English translations of that, there are Telugu translations of that, Hindi translations of that. So Aryabhatiya of Aryabhatta is translated primary source. Similarly, Bhaskaracharya's Bijaganita has its English translation, authentic English translation, which is essentially a translated primary source. Similarly, Brihat Samhita of Varahamihira, Ganita Sara Sangraha of Mahaviracharya, then Ganita Yukti Bhasha, Goladipika of Parameshwara, Grahalagavam, Karana Kutuhalam of Bhaskaracharya too, Karana Paddhati or Puttumana Somayaji with basically all the explanatory notes. These are all translated primary sources. They're not in original language of that they were written in. Some of these are written in Malayalam, some of these are written in Sanskritam and things like that, but they may be in English or Hindi or any other Bharatiya Bhasha or other languages. So that is a translated primary source. Now, again, so we talked about the classification framework and we talked about all of these primary texts could be translated to. Now, what are the secondary sources? For example, if you want to look at the archive.org or the National Manuscript Mission or the Sanskrit documents, there are various websites where you can find a lot of information. Or if you want to look at the Catalogus Catalogorum, which talks about various manuscripts that are available across the country. And there are books like science, technology, and medicine in colonial India, or history, science, and society in the Indian context. So many things, and there are many video lectures that are available, and all of these things are essentially secondary sources of IKS literature. So, what takes the primary sources, then translated primary sources and secondary sources. So even on internet, you'll find a lot of journals like Bhavana, Indian Journal of Traditional Knowledge, Indian Journal of History of Science, then Hamsi. Then there are educational modules by like Professor Michel Danino on basically science in ancient India, technology in ancient India. There are many textbooks, knowledge, traditions and practices of India, KTPI textbooks. There are index of ancient Indian mathematics. There are many modules like this, journals that you'll find, which are very authentic sources of knowledge. Then again, Puranas, for example, if you want to look at that, how are they classified? Again, they come into Mahapuranas, Upapuranas, and Sthala Puranas. If you look at this literature, most of the primary literature I was talking about is written in basically the Sanskritam or language like that, so mostly in Sanskritam. But then when you come to Puranas, there are Mahapuranas, there are about 18 of them, 4 lakh verses. Imagine 4 lakh verses of just Mahapuranas. And there are Upapuranas, the 18 smaller Puranas, which are smaller than the Mahapuranas but are prominent. So then there are these Sthala Puranas, which are talking about the Purana, the history, or the basically how the things evolved in a particular place. And these are much more in regional language. You will see a lot of Sthala Puranas written in various regional languages. And if you want to look at what a knowledge system looks like, so this is an example of agriculture. I'm not taking the common examples of mathematics, astronomy, because they are very well known. This is one of the less studied examples, therefore I'm putting it up here. In fact, as we looked at earlier, engineering and science of agriculture was very well developed in our country. Even 10,000 years ago, we had agriculture, and first textbook of agriculture in the world was written in our country, Krushi Parashara. And Kashyapiya Krushi Sukti, even that tentative date of 4000 BCE is a very tentative date. We don't really know. That is the best guess that we have. It could be much older than that. So imagine, in our country, we had the world's first textbook at least 2500 years ago. It could be much older than that. And Kashyapiya Krushi Sukti was written by Kashyapa in 800 CE. And Lokopakara by Chaudaraya in 10th century. Then Surapala wrote Vrukshayurveda in 10th century. Someshwara Deva compiled Manasollasa in 12th century. Sarangadhara basically compiled Upavana Vinoda in 13th century. Vishwavallabha by Chakrapani Mishra in 15th century. Nuskadar Fanni Falahat by Darasiko in 17th century. Krishi Gita by Parashurama in 17th century. What do you see here? You see a continuity in tradition. This is spread across the country, across the time scales, and across all languages. So, for example, the Vrukshayurveda, you will find versions of this not only in Sanskrit, but in regional languages like Odia, Punjabi, Hindi, and even Telugu. And the Krishi Gita, the last one in the example there, is a 17th century text written in Malayalam. And Nuskadar Fanni Falahat is a Farsi, written in Farsi language. So you can see agriculture, you had all of these things in multiple times across the time scales. This is essentially the characteristics of a knowledge system that exists. So how do we identify a primary source? So first of all, you'll have to see if you can identify a primary source. Do consult an expert. Make sure that you find at least multiple secondary sources, because if there is a primary text that is authentic, many people would have commented on it. So there would be some peer-reviewed literature, there would be bhashyas commenting. Whenever I say peer-reviewed literature, not just the modern ones, but also in the ancient times, in terms of the bhashyas, vartikas, karikas, tikas, etc. There would be commentaries, translation, and there would be evidence from multiple independent sources. Therefore, you will have to look at sutra, bhashya, vartika, karika, or vyakhya. What kind of a text are you talking about? This is the way to identify an authentic source. Just as we saw, this is how you identify an authentic source. And then, you see, why should we care about others' work? Can't we do everything on our own? That is essentially the question that a lot of us grapple with. But, even Sir Isaac Newton said, I don't know what I may seem to the world, but to myself I seem like a child playing on the seashore. And he was a giant, and he said he was a child playing on a seashore looking for a shell here, whereas the great ocean of truth lay unexplored before me. And therefore, we all stand on the shoulders of the giants. And it's important that we build on our traditions, knowledge traditions, which have such a rigorous foundations, and we can learn from them, learn from the wisdom of our elders. And as the Upanishad Vakya says, iti shushramadhiranam yenastat vichakshare. Thus we learn from the wise who explain to us in a very good way. And that's essentially how we should be thinking about IKS sources. In this short episode, we saw how we can explore and identify authentic sources in the Indian knowledge systems domain, because this domain is vast. There are millions and millions of unexplored literature, manuscript that are lying around, and there is a lot of information and misinformation floating around. How do you identify the authentic sources? We just saw through how we can do that in a very practical, easy, and rigorous way. And now I hope you have sufficiently been inspired to look into Indian knowledge systems, and hopefully you have followed methods, looked at methods to identify authentic sources. You have done your research, and you are like all excited to teach this knowledge, Indian knowledge systems, to your students, and you want to explore this world. You want to do authentic research in this area, domain of Indian knowledge systems. So then the question becomes, how should we teach and do research in IKS? Let us explore that. Yeah. How should we teach and do research in IKS? This is the kind of question that we will have, right? So let us look at some of the current prevalent practices. So one of the practices is to start IKS departments or centers and start individual master's programs in IKS. What are the other ways in which we can improve upon these prevalent practices? Essentially, for example, one of the things that we need to be looking into is training faculty in IKS domain that is relevant to their actual domain. So, for example, what I mean by that is a chemistry professor should be looking into Rasayana Shastra, or a mathematics professor should be looking into Ganita Shastra, or a fine arts professor should be looking into Natya Shastra, and a law professor should be looking into Dharma Shastra, and a civil engineering professor can be looking into basically the Vastu Shastra and Shilpa Shastra. That is the kind of requirement that is there, because when we look at the faculty members, all of these domains are inherently technical, and they need that kind of a domain knowledge to be brought into. And then also IKS is inherently interdisciplinary. So for example, if you look at any of the classical texts like Aryabhatiya or basically Siddhanta Jyotisha or any of these texts, they will have knowledge of mathematics and Jyotisha in it. If you look at Rasayana Shastra texts, they will have knowledge of Rasayana Shastra, the chemistry. Along with that, they will also have Siddha or Ayurveda knowledge embedded into that. So these are the kind of things that we already had. So therefore, it is important to preserve the interdisciplinary nature that is inherent to Indian knowledge systems, even in our courses. So we need to develop courses that are interdisciplinary in nature and will span multiple disciplines. And then another thing that we need to think about is to start Indian knowledge systems minors. So for example, a student can take bachelor's in a bachelor's program, one course every semester, extra course every semester in a particular domain of IKS, and then maybe during their undergraduate program can take 6 to 7 courses, and then that should basically lead to a IKS minor, and that will basically provide an opportunity for students to specialize in various domains of IKS without compromising their existing degrees that they are pursuing. And we also need to think about enrolling PhD students who qualify UGC NET in IKS domains in various departments. And also we need to encourage research in the STEM disciplines in Bharatiya Bhashas. This is one of the fundamental things that is very important, because if we encourage Bharatiya Bhashas, research in Bharatiya Bhashas in all the disciplines, whether it is in STEM, social sciences or arts and things like that, humanities, it becomes very important, because then all those issues with the non-translatables in the IKS and all that, understand the cultural context, all that becomes very easy, and we should be able to do it in a very effective manner. And if you want to teach an overview of an IKS as a course, for example, I mean, this is just one example of that, we need to be thinking about teaching a survey of the IKS domains. What are the domains that IKS covers? What is IKS? What is a knowledge system? What makes this knowledge system Indian? All of those things need to be covered in one module at least. And then we need to emphasize to the students what are the sources of knowledge. We just talked about in one of the previous episodes about the differences between the Sutra text, Bhashya text, Vartika and Karika and all of that are different texts. So we need to be talking about the differences in the texts that we have. We need to talk about the Ashtadasha or Chaturdasha Vidyasthanas, 18 or 14 Vidyasthanas that we have. And then we need to emphasize on the vocabulary of IKS. We need to specially emphasize on the non-translatables that are inherent to Indian knowledge systems, because the words, language is not simply a form of communication, but is also the vehicle of that reflects the Jivana Darshana or the philosophy, foundational philosophy from which that knowledge, that language has arisen. That means Bharatiya Bhashas will have inherently in them the Jivana Darshana or the Bharatiya Drishti inherent to them. Whereas any other language coming from a different society will have that knowledge system embedded into their language, usage, idioms, all of those things. So it's important that we emphasize on basically using proper terminology and use basically the terms where they are non-translatable. For example, very common example is of dharma, which is mistranslated as religion, because dharma is not religion. Dharma is much more encompassing, and if you think about it, the word dharma, we all understand, all Bharatiyas understand it, because whether you talk about it in Telugu, Marathi, Assamese, Bengali, Kashmiri or Malayalam, dharma is dharma. Everybody understands what dharma means, because we are all coming from the same civilizational thought process, the Jivana Darshana. We are all Bharatiyas, so that Jivana Darshana is same, so we don't need to translate it into any other our own language. I mean, dharma is dharma for us. So therefore it is important for emphasizing on the use of proper terminologies. And we also need to understand that Jivana Darshana, that philosophical foundations of IKS, this also needs to be introduced to the students. And we need to introduce the various methods in IKS, because like pramanas, with the concept of pramanas, the tantra yuktis, the way in which we establish the truth by talking about pramanas in a vada and various forms of vada, all of these things need to be talked about as the part of the methods of the IKS. Why is this important? When you look at this kind of a course, we are not looking at simply transfer of information, but we are talking about emphasizing on the understanding, the conceptual understanding of IKS. Because once a student has such an understanding of IKS, then conceptual understanding of IKS, then they can go on and specialize in mathematics, Rasayana Shastra, Ayurveda, Natya Shastra, Shilpa Shastra, or any other Shastra, Krishi Shastra, Pashu Ayurveda, all of those things, without losing the touch with the philosophical foundation of the Jivana Darshana. That makes that knowledge pursuit Bharatiya in its outlook and implementation. And when we look into other aspects of this Indian knowledge systems, when we are developing courses, we have to take special care to use only authentic sources, because what we are transmitting has to be authentic. Therefore, we need to depend on authentic sources. And in one of the previous episodes, we discussed about how do we identify authentic sources and things like that. And another aspect that we need to emphasize is the continuity of the Indian knowledge tradition, because from ancient times we had that kind of a knowledge tradition that was continuous, and even as recently as 18th and 19th century. Unfortunately, for last 200 years, nearly 200 years, we had a break there. But even then, it is dormant and not dead. That is why we are a living civilization. And therefore, emphasizing on that continuity enables all our children to connect with not only the recent past, but also the historic past. And then that continuity as a civilization will bring basically that kind of a confidence that will help children to become not only Atmanirbhar in the physical material needs, but also in the thoughts. And also we should highlight the characteristic features, methods, objectives, and the core concepts of all the knowledge traditions of our Bharat, and then highlight the differences between Bharatiya knowledge systems and the knowledge traditions of the world. There are these differences, and we need to be cognizant of that and while we are accepting the other traditions, we also need to be rooted firmly in our own knowledge traditions, which is what NEP talks about, rootedness in India. Therefore, another thing that we need to be talking about is we need to go away from teaching IKS as a subject of history, because IKS studies are not history studies. Therefore, we need to emphasize on the contemporary applications of the Indian knowledge traditions. And this has so many dimensions to this, and these are so relevant even today. For example, we can talk about water management techniques, even in today's era of climate change. We can talk about improving the soil health using traditional methods. We can talk about using the rasa theory to understand how customers react to a product or things like that, or audience reacts to a play or things like that. And the medium of instruction for the Indian knowledge systems courses should be in Bharatiya Bhashas as much as possible. And all the technical terms and citations from the Sanskrit sources, we should try to give the Devanagari script along with that transliteration, so that it will help the maximum number of students and maximum number of faculty members and students across the country. Now that we have looked at how do we teach Indian knowledge systems, let us see what do we mean by research in IKS or IKS research. So remember, whenever we talk about IKS research, it has to be informed by the Bharatiya Drishti, the Parampara, and the Laukika Prayojana. Therefore, all these three aspects need to be accounted for in any research that we do. Therefore, we need to be, again, noting the interdisciplinary nature of the IKS, we need to be thinking about interdisciplinary proposals. So that will integrate IKS with the modern disciplines in a comprehensive way. And this is something very, very important for us to understand. And all the research in the IKS should be something that has clear objectives and has measurable outputs. We cannot be talking about objectives that are not clear or outputs that are not measurable. We need to be having concrete outputs and measurable clear objectives. And this research, because we want to establish, and remember, you are going to be the pioneers in these areas of IKS research. Therefore, it is important for you to make sure that there is a connect with the Indian knowledge systems and the contemporary problems. Therefore, we need to be emphasizing on research that will lead to solutions to current societal problems using IKS. Just to give you a few examples, we can think about research in using evidence-based music and dance therapies based on Bharatiya Sangeeta Shastra, Carnatic music or Hindustani music or various dance forms that are there, to treat the anxiety and depression in the youth, because that is a major problem in our society right now. Can we treat them using music therapy where it is based on Bharatiya Sangeeta Shastra? This could be one research that can be done, where we gather evidence and where we show the effectiveness of all these approaches. As our Honorable Prime Minister said, परिणाम मिलते हैं, प्रमाण नहीं मिलते. We need to search for those pramanas. प्रमाण देखने पड़ेंगे हमको. So now when we talk about the pramanas, then we have a concept that, science is as if science is monolithic. But if you look into the methodology of science, the scientific process itself, science is not monolithic. It has two parts. One part is scientific principles, and then the second part is the scientific method. The scientific method is essentially all the body of techniques that we use for investigating various phenomena, and this method is objective. That means whether I do the experiment or you do the experiment or somebody does it in Africa, South America or North America or Europe or Australia, they will all get the same results as long as the experimental conditions are the same. So if I do a titration here or in Africa or in US, they're all going to be the same, giving me the same result because the experimental conditions are same, method is same. So the scientific method is objective. It is not dependent on the culture. It is not dependent on the place. It is dependent only on the experimental conditions. And it is not dependent on who is performing it. But then the scientific principles, though, are a product of the civilization where they were first envisioned. And therefore you will see, for example, to give you one very common example, the Greek mathematics is very axiomatic in thinking. So the Greek mathematics is all about axioms, and then starts with axioms and then starts everything, builds on that. Whereas the Bharatiya Ganita was much more about computational or algorithmic in its approach. So we did not really have axioms per se. We had algorithms and computational methods to calculate. Therefore, we have called our thing as Ganita, something to calculate. And therefore, when I am talking about the difference in the principles, please note that the principles are eternal, methods keep evolving. So the methods of modern mathematics and mathematics have been evolving. And similarly, if you look into methods in Ayurveda, all of these things, they have been evolving. But the principles are the same. And so that is very important to know. And at the same time, when I'm talking about the principles that are eternal, methods that are evolving, please note that we are not talking about pseudoscience here. We are talking about actual science, scientific thinking, but with a Bharatiya drishti in it. So therefore, pseudoscience, how do you recognize pseudoscience? Basically, we follow what Karl Popper said. We have to have a falsifiable theory. If you cannot formulate a theory that is capable of admitting conflicting, possible, conceivable conflicting observations, then that is essentially not a scientific thesis statement. So therefore, we need to be careful about making sure that whenever we are talking about scientific principles that are dependent on the civilization that has given basically birth to them, we are not talking about pseudoscience. We are talking about scientific rigor and all of those rigor that we talked about, pramanas, vada, tantra yukti, all of those things, that rigor is there. And the PEL model of science talks about presupposition, evidence, and logic. The presupposition are the principles, evidence is objective methods, result from the methods, and then the logic is the one that connects. So the Indian knowledge systems can contribute in the presupposition and the logic in a major way, even in today's modern science and technologies. So the methods evolve. So we have to adapt with times. For example, if you look at the left there, we see Varna, Nischandratvam, Varitara, Unama, Rekha Purnata. These are all various methods that are described in Ayurveda for testing the bhasmas or the mineral ashes that are made in Siddha and Ayurveda. So basically, these are like your motichur laddu. With motichur is essentially your nanoparticles, and that laddu is your microparticle aggregate. And that's what these are. I mean, and the bhasmas are. And how do you study them? You can look at their color, that is Varna, Nischandratum, whether they are glossy or not, Varitara, whether it floats on water or not. These are the traditional methods. But then today, because of the scientific advances, we have a lot of new advanced techniques. For example, we can use a scanning electron microscope, SEM. We can use a transmission electron microscope, TEM. We can use an XRD, X-ray diffraction methods. We can use XPS scattering, EDAX, fluorescence, basically spectroscopy, atomic absorption spectroscopy, so on and so forth. There are all many methods that are there. So we should use modern methods, but with the principles that are there in eternal, that are constant, that are reflecting the Bharatiya drishti. So methods evolve, we adapt with times, but the principles are eternal. Yeah. All of these things really impact how we can use the Indian knowledge systems to address current problems. Because you see, we being one of the oldest continuous civilization in the world, today we have accumulated a lot of wisdom. And that wisdom is something that will help us in addressing some of the problems that the world is facing today. For example, whenever we talk about something, current problem of climate change. So the narrative is that we might go from one type of climate to another type of climate. That means it can be from green forest to desertification of land, so it may change into a desert. But then the thing is not that it will change from the green forests, lush green forests, to desert in one day or 1 year or in one decade. It actually goes through many cycles of forest fires, floods, droughts, all of those things, and then it goes through the next change in the state. And this change is often reversible at many places in between. And this is where we can tap into our traditional wisdom and understand how do we address all of these problems and trying to preserve the current state of the world in a way that is actually mitigates the climate change, adverse impacts of the climate change. And these are the kind of things that we can think about. For example, the water resource management techniques, forestation techniques, so many things that we currently can learn from Indian knowledge systems to understand and address the problems of the world of 21st century. Now we have looked in this short episode about how do we teach and we conduct research in Indian knowledge systems. As you saw, Indian knowledge systems is inherently multidisciplinary. It has, therefore, we have to develop courses that are interdisciplinary in nature, and we have to think about preserving the Bharatiya Drishti in it, the Jivana Darshana, Bharatiya Drishti. That means we need to be emphasizing on thinking about the non-translatable concepts, the concepts that are core at the core of the Indian knowledge system, and we need to be using the proper terminologies, understand the methodology of the IKS, and then communicate these kind of concepts to our students through our various courses.